Welcome everybody this morning to today's mutual learning webinar of the European Network of Public Employment Services on the topic of improving labour market access for people with disabilities. My name is Ed Thorpe. I'll be moderating this session with a lot of support from our resident PES expert, Eamon Davern. As I said, we have 1.5 hours ahead of us, and we've got a lot of really interesting content to cover. We're going to be looking at the policy context. We're going to be looking at some of the latest thinking around what can be done by public employment services and their partners in terms of improving labour market access, with reference to specific examples from different countries, public employment services and their partners. And we'll be getting some thoughts from a representative of the European Disability Forum from their perspective of how they see this issue and what public employment services can do. So as I said, before I go into the bit more detail on the precise agenda that we have ahead of us, I'd like to give the floor to Elodie Fazi from DG Employment. She's the head of the PES Network Secretariat, and she'll give us a few words of welcome. Elodie.
Thank you, Ed. Good morning, colleagues. I'm very pleased to welcome you to this webinar. For those of you who are less familiar with the work of the PES Network, it was created in 2014, and it brings together the PES of 27 member states, as well as Iceland, Liechtenstein, and Norway. And the aim of the network is to strengthen the cooperation between public employment services so they can learn together, but also act together in tackling the challenges they face. So coming to the topic of today's webinar, it's clear that public employment services have a key responsibility to steer a more accessible labour market. Obviously, they have a key role to play to help reduce the gap between the employment rate of persons with disabilities and persons without disabilities. And as we will see today, this gap is still way too high in the EU. A couple of months ago, we did a survey in the network, and we found out that more than 2/3 of PES have a significant role in supporting the inclusion of job seekers with disabilities. We also saw that close to 1/3 of PES are specialized case workers, but actually several, but really far from a majority, also have specific strategies to support job seekers with disabilities. Obviously, in most cases, PES are not doing this on their own, and this task is really shared with other authorities. We're thinking obviously of labour ministries, municipalities, but also in particular NGOs, rehabilitation agencies, or health services. And we're really pleased, really honored to have such a large number of participants today, not only from PES, but really from the key partners. I think this really means a lot to us because hopefully we can really act as multipliers, as agents of change to raise awareness and take action on that. As we'll see today, there's really not one standard way that PES are organized in the EU, but I think it's fair to say that there has been a really strong momentum in the last years among many PES to really step up their efforts and to do better to support job seekers with disabilities. And we as a network have really tried to contribute to this momentum. And we're really pleased today to share with you one of our latest publications, so the PES Network Toolkit on support to job seekers with disabilities. The toolkit was launched a couple of weeks ago, actually, during the Czech Presidency Conference on 21st of September. And it is also a deliverable under the Commission's Disability Employment Package. There you can find really a lot of practical guidance. I won't go into the detail because you will hear a lot more today. So I think at this stage, all I can say is to really wish you a good webinar. I hope you find inspiration in the toolkit, in the discussions with peers today, and I hand over back to Ed for the moderation. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Elodie, for those words of welcome. Indeed, it's great to see so many people joining us today. We know this is a really key topic, not just for the labour market in general, but for so many individuals and families across Europe. And there's lots of progress still to be made, and hopefully we can get some inspiration and learning from each other in today's webinar. So I promised that I would give you a bit more detail about the agenda we've got ahead of us. We're going to start in a second. I'll be inviting a colleague from DG Employment to give us a little bit of an overview of the policy context, to give a framework for our discussions, including some more details about the disability employment package that now exists at European level. Then Elodie just mentioned that there is a PES Network Practitioners Toolkit, and Eamon will take the floor for a few minutes to give us an overview of that toolkit and how that can be used and how that can support public employment services and their partner organizations to be more effective on this topic. And then we dive into some of the practical examples that we hope can be inspiring and provoke some thoughts and discussions afterwards as well. We're joined by Sandrine Portier from Pôle Emploi, the public employment service in France, who will be telling us about a one-day national event during which job seekers with disabilities can visit workplaces and discuss workplace integration issues. Then from Belgium, Dan Henkens is with us. He doesn't work for the Public Employment Service, but is representing this crucial aspect of partnerships. So Dan works for a GTB, which is an NGO, and they're working with the Public Employment Service in Flanders. And he'll be telling us about the placement and support methodology, individual placement and support that they're using there. And as I said earlier, then our final contributor, who I think is joining us hopefully soon, is from the European Disability Forum, and we'll bring that kind of wider perspective from how they see the future of the efforts by public employment services and their partners. That said, we look forward now to hearing from our first presenter, Immaculada Placencia Porrero from DG Employment. And Immaculada, I give you the floor for the next, you have 10 minutes to give us an overview of the policy context and particularly the disability employment package. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for the invitation to provide you the policy background of this initiative. And I will try to provide you the context in which this package was born, and the background in which this package is going to be developed. Okay, so first of all, let me tell you that the package is part of the European Disability Strategy. It was announced in the European Disability, so in the Strategy for the Rights of Persons with Disabilities 2021-2030 to be precise. The strategy was intended and is intended to improve the situation of persons with disabilities. Today, we're talking about employment. We know that there is a big gap. I will give you figures in a second, more detailed figures in a second. There is a gap between persons with and without disabilities in relation to employment. But this gap is much more wider than employment. There is a gap in education. Persons with disabilities leave earlier school and they attain lower educational levels. They have difficulties in accessing healthcare. They feel discriminated. They have less access to internet. And still several millions of them live in institutions apart from the community. So this picture is what the strategy aimed to tackle. To do that, the strategy contains 8 priority areas. As I was saying, we have 8 areas. We were talking about in the area 3, independent living, non-discrimination, promoting the rights of persons with disabilities globally, the way in which deliver the strategy, the role or the activities that the Commission is going to do as an employer also to improve the conditions of persons with disabilities in relation to the institutions, and some awareness raising. We have 7 flagship initiatives, one of them being the employment package. So the strategy identifies employment as the best pathway for inclusion and participation in society. Employment in the open labor market is a right recognized for persons with disabilities in the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. This for achieving or for enjoyment of these rights, which is currently not a reality for most persons with disabilities, many actions need to be taken. And that is where the Commission presented this employment package in the strategy as a number of measures, pulling together a number of measures so that we can tackle the gaps that I referred to. The idea is to have with the package, on one hand, a new knowledge base to put together knowledge, information, practices, in which we can see that persons with disabilities gain employment, more employment, but also better employment. We need to work into the quality of the employment that persons with disabilities have. To that end, I mean, the strategy also calls for the introduction of targets at member state level to reduce that employment gap that, by the way, now in the context of the European Pillar of Social Rights Action Plan, the gap is one indicator. For the first time in this context of employment, we do have an indicator that will monitor how the employment of persons with disabilities is evolving. Now, I promised that I would give you more figures on the situation of persons with disabilities in the labor market. We know that there is a gap of about 20 points between 50 and 70% on the employment of persons with and without disabilities, but that is not the only gap that we need to tackle. We know that they are overrepresented in unemployment, and particularly persons with severe disabilities is figures of 17 and 29%, but we of employment, so almost 30% of unemployment rate. But this figure is not significant enough in the sense that is not capturing the reality of a large majority of persons with disabilities, and that is that they are not even active in the labor market. I was mentioned this 30% of unemployment of persons with disabilities, but 42% of them are not even active in the labor market. So there is an activity gap, an average activity gap of 20%. So this gives you the picture, the policy picture in which we need to take action, because it is really a difficult situation, because this gap persists, is a very persistent gap. The employment levels are really stagnated around this 50%. Is better in some member states than others. We produce, by the way, indicators and we monitor the situation, but we need to tackle this and to close that gap by improving, of course, the employment level of persons with disabilities, and not by, you know, in situations of crisis and unemployment, we see a decrease of the general employment, and then the gap seems to close a little bit, but the situation of persons with disabilities does not improve. So this gives you an idea of the employment of persons with disabilities. I'm going to walk you through quickly, in view of the 10 minutes allocated to me, I'm going to walk you through the different elements of strands of the employment package. The first one is the subject matter of today is about strengthening the capacities of employment and integration services, and we were really very happy to see the toolkit to provide this guidance for the PES network, and beyond even that, because I think the guidance that has been produced helps also employers, future employers of persons with disabilities to know how to better address their needs and support them in their career. So this is the first area. The second area is about hiring perspective through affirmative action and combating stereotypes. The idea is to put on the table a catalogue of positive actions that will give inspiration to employers on taking action, because what we know is that when employer tries to employ a person with a disability, or an employee that they have acquires a disability, often they do not know what to do. They do not know even where to turn to get support in order to do the accommodation. So that is part of also relates to the next one, which is about how to provide reasonable accommodation. But on affirmative action, I mean, there are many measures. We have got quotas, financial incentives, supported employment. You know, there are many different activities, and we will have a catalog soon published. We're working with our network of experts. Then we have as I mentioned, the area of reasonable accommodation. This is at the end where essential part is an obligation in EU law to provide reasonable accommodation to persons with disabilities. But as I said, support for employer is needed, knowledge about it is needed to have this diversity of persons with disabilities being accommodated in jobs in Europe. Then we have the area of retaining employment by preventing the disabilities association with chronic illnesses. The idea is that chronic illness can be better managed at the workplace, and when persons acquire disabilities, that again the accommodation is provided, but often there is a risk. This risk of acquiring disabilities can be preventing and supported when the chronic diseases are addressed in the adequate way. So we are working with our agency on health and safety, and a manual on managing and preventing chronic illnesses will be produced. We have the fifth area, which is about vocational rehabilitation schemes in case of sickness and accidents. And the idea here is that it's about retention. It's about the persons with disabilities. When they get ill or they get an accident, they can have access to the rehabilitation, not only the physical rehabilitation, but the vocational rehabilitation, so that they either can retain the workplace that they had, or they get other employment opportunities, even, of course, and hopefully within their own employer, but that they get, instead of passing to the unemployment group, that they retain employment and that they have employment opportunities. There again, a guideline will be provided. And finally, we come to the point 6, the area 6, about sheltered employment. The idea here is really to better understand what is sheltered employment, how it operates, and how can it contribute to as a pathway to the open labor market. I mentioned the convention at the beginning that gives us our policy compass on many areas of work in relation to disability policies. Well, there, the right of persons with disabilities to participate in employment in the open labor market on equal basis with others is spelled out. There is a general comment that analyzes those rights and obligations for state parties to make sure that this right can be enjoyed by persons with disabilities on equal basis with others. However, the term sheltered employment is still used very imprecisely, because sometimes we get complaints of persons with disabilities on dramatic situations and conditions in a so-called sheltered employment. Persons with disabilities, we have received complaints saying that in order to receive a disability benefit, they are obliged to work in so-called sheltered employment without salary, without pensions, without holidays, if they, without the opportunity basically to move outside to the open labor market, because then they would lose the disability benefits. On the other hand, we have examples of groups of persons with disabilities or companies organized, for example, to develop software. In the meantime, we have centers that are focusing on rehabilitation, others that are focusing on vocational training and occupational therapy, and all those fall into the umbrella name of sheltered employment. There we need to really, the idea that we have is to launch this study that hopefully will clarify to us a little bit more the different models, but also the conditions, to have a good overview of the conditions in which people operate and work, and why and what can be done in order to enhance that transition, because at the end, persons with disabilities, like anybody else, what they want is a good job in the and good conditions, good employment conditions. And we will, after presenting the package, we are now working on preparation of the deliverables. So we started a bit later, so that's why I just had the 10 minutes. So thank you for your attention.
Fine, thank you. No, I just wanted to say thank you for that excellent overview of the policy context, and also some really important practical issues that are being experienced and seen in the implementation of some of these policies. There was also a question about whether there'll be a report about this webinar, which I'll address now. The recording of the webinar will be made available. There won't be a report as such. The main output really linked to this webinar is the toolkit. So the toolkit's already published, and this webinar is now kind of is linked to that. So we recommend that you go and look at the toolkit as the key output from the PES network on this topic. And in that context, I'm now delighted to be able to pass the floor to Eamon. I introduced Eamon before. He's our expert, a public employment services expert, and he'll be giving us an overview, please, Eamon, of this toolkit and what people can find in it.
So good morning, everybody. First of all, I'd like to stress that I co-authored the toolkit with a colleague, Angela Genova, and also I'd like to thank, as ever, the Secretariat and, of course, the PES Network members for their excellent input. Clearly, there is a very strong moral and indeed economic case for improving integration of people with disabilities. In terms of the overall context, we have this continuing paradox in Europe of skill shortages, but also a situation where, unfortunately, people in vulnerable positions on the labour market are tending to be more likely to be employed in occupations which are going to be most affected by labour market restructuring. So clearly there is an urgent need for action. The toolkit essentially addresses three particular issues. One, it talks about why the subject is indeed so important. Secondly, it describes what public employment services and indeed other actors, indeed employers and support organisations can do. And then it also looks at examples of how employment services and others can act to improve the situation for people with disabilities. As Immaculada mentioned, there is a significant mismatch between the overall employment rate and that for people with disabilities. And that, of course, isn't taking into account the large number of people who are indeed discouraged workers or inactive and not registered with employment services. Currently, the overall employment rate in Europe is approaching 75%, I think about 74.8, but only just over half, 50.6% would be the employment rate for people with disabilities, which is a great disparity. We have the very clear policy response in terms of disability employment package. And there is also, this is part of a strategy up to 2030 to improve the situation of people with disabilities on the labour market. And clearly, a key part of the overall disability employment package is an objective to strengthen the capacity of employment support integration services. Of those, PES are perhaps the most important agency to facilitate increased integration, to deliver the outcomes desired through the package. And the toolkit provides guidance on how public employment services and indeed other organisations can increase the employment situation of people with disabilities. So can we have the next slide, please? Thank you. So what kind of actions can public employment services take? Firstly, it's very important that public employment services themselves are role models in making the best use of all available talent in their recruitment practices and indeed their overall internal HR management and personnel policies. PES can be agents for the distribution and development of material to support job placement of people with disabilities. Public employment services are either direct agents or commissioners of active labour market programmes to support and promote the employment of people with disabilities. This can be through a variety of measures to support overcoming barriers to employment and incentivizing employers to recruit people with disabilities. Actions can include helping employers to make adjustments to their workplaces to assist the employment of people with disabilities, and outreach measures to both employers, job seekers, and indeed specialist support organisations are of course very important to raise the profile and the awareness of this very important issue. But as for many other areas of recruitment, partnership working is especially important. Public employment services need to work with specialist providers and employers, and indeed research institutions, to ensure that there is an overall constituency of activity dedicating to improving the situation on this very important issue. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the toolkit explained how this group of support organisations, and particularly the public employment services, can implement measures to deliver the desired outcomes of the European disability package. Firstly, it's absolutely important that we map the current situation. We need to know where we're starting. So in all member states, we need to know which organisations are involved, how much progress has been made, and indeed what more needs to be done, and what should be our priority actions to get the best possible outcome from the collective input from all of the organisations involved in supporting this agenda. So clearly, a systematic approach starts with the development of a strategy, and the toolkit addresses this particular issue. It also gives information on how, stemming from the strategy, an implementation plan can be developed to ensure that we can increase the opportunities for people with disability on the labour market. Further to this, it's very important, once we have an implementation plan, to of course review and periodically seek to improve our implementation approach. And given the particularly fluid situation on the labour market, particularly in the context of the emergence from the COVID pandemic, it's ever more important to ensure that disability employment measures are reviewed to take account of these frequent labour market changes. The toolkit provides many examples of how PES can increase their profile on this particular agenda, and also give steers as to how ultimately public employment services can seek to mainstream all of their activities for disability support, so that indeed people with disabilities on the labour market are indeed fully integrated, and all activities are developed with an assumption that disabled people have equal access to the programs and support, to ensure that the equal right for disabled people to work and employment, as in this sort of UN position, can indeed be achieved. So clearly the toolkit is there to ensure that people can fully comply with a commitment to achieve these outcomes on this very important agenda. Can we have the final slide, please? And we'd urge you to access the toolkit, which has recently been launched through the Czech presidency, and there's a link there for you to look at the document and explore it in more detail, and hopefully find it of use, whatever your background, in terms of delivering your own approaches to improve integration. Thank you very much, Ed.
Thank you, Eamon. And yeah, we definitely recommend the toolkit to everyone, and hope that people will go and look at it and see how they can use it to inspire their own work at home. But I think now we're going to move on from the toolkit to dive into some practical examples of what public employment services are doing, which can help to focus our thoughts on what is possible. And our first presenter in that context is Sandrine Portier from Pôle emploi, who's going to be talking to us about an initiative that they've been running in France, looking to work with people with disabilities. Sandrine, please, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to try to be as short as possible. Duo Day is about facilitating access to the labor market for people with disabilities. And on the other hand, it's about changing the way people think about disabilities. So how does it work concretely. Duo in French, so pairs. Pairs are made between a company from the private or public sector and a person with a disability. So and they can post their willingness to make a pair on a platform, on a dedicated platform. And the program for one day, because Duo Day is only during one day every year, includes discovering the occupation of the profession, also active participation and immersion. And as a result, it's an opportunity to meet and change the way of looking at things and overcome prejudices, because it's that's the main issue about disabilities. So as I said, companies and candidates post their offer on a platform, and Pôle emploi is one of the partners. It's not the only one. It's not the only stakeholder, sorry. Pôle emploi is one of the many different partners that are involved in this initiative. For employers, it's an open and free way to consider disabilities differently. It's not mandatory, and maybe it's one of the key success to for Duo Day. For employers, so it allows them to discover professional skills, but also soft skills, which is very important for this kind of public with disabilities. And what is important too is that it's a how could I say, smooth, soft, and welcoming moment. It's not a recruiting moment. It's a discovering moment. So they can share together and think about how they are already committed in a social policy. On the other side, for persons with disabilities, Duo Day is a good way to make them feel more confident to discover a working environment, or fine-tune a professional project, or even convince an employer in terms of integration of their performance or whatever. And as I said, it's a good opportunity, and it's a good moment to show what can be their soft skills, not only the technical ones, but how they can behave within a company. When it comes to a professional partners, as I said, Pôle emploi is one of them, but not only. These different stakeholders, they act as a go-between to make pairs, and they size Duo Day to better understand the expectations, but also obstacles, sorry, from employers, to better support them in their projects, and to integrate in the best way employees with a disability. Moreover, for these different partners, it's Duo Day is a different way to build different relations with employers. It's an event once a year, and they can have a discussion in a different way. As I said, it's not mandatory, so it's more flexible. As you can see, there are a few figures, key figures for 2021, because this year for 2022, it's in progress. In 1 month, actually, there will be the Duo Day in November, and there is another very important thing to my eyes that I would like to flag, is that Pôle emploi is also involved as an employer to welcome persons with disabilities and make as many pairs as possible. So we are organizing internally to welcome people with disabilities from the national level to the local offices in support functions, but also with the counselors or managers or different positions within Pôle emploi. So I hope that this edition this year will be a success. And I forgot to say before ending that there is also a participant today with us, which is Agnès Chabiran, who is the expert for Duo Day. So I'm talking on behalf of her, but if you have questions or if you want to have any additional information, she will be able to give you anything you would like to know after this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Sandrine. A very interesting presentation of that initiative in France. But one of the key things that Sandrine mentioned in her presentation was the importance of partnerships, that it wasn't Pôle emploi on its own, it was working with its partners. And that links nicely with the next example also from Belgium, because as I said before, Dan Henkens, who joins us representing GTB, which is an NGO, is working with the Public Employment Service on an initiative looking at individual placement and support, and Dan is gonna explain that to us now for the next 10 minutes. Dan, please.
Thank you for having me, and I'm happy to give you some more information about our IPS program. First of all, I'm gonna start with a little bit of history, but we started in 2018 with the National Institute of Health and Disability Insurance in Belgium as a scientific research project to be able to go to implementation after 5 years, but only evidence-based. Because Belgium is exists of 3 regions, they were looking for partners, and they founded it with VDAB. It's our employment service, with whom we work together a lot of times. So we initiated the IPS program in 2018 together with them. We have 23 IPS coaches. We have 7 IPS supervisors, and we work across 5 provincial teams. But what is IPS? And that's maybe more important. That stands for Individual Placement and Support. It's a methodology that's developed in the US like 40 years ago for people with severe mental illnesses, but with an active demand for paid work. IPS and support employment is mentioned a lot of times together because it's a form of supported employment. And it's because we work on finding and keeping a paid job for our clients. International scientific research is done a lot of times in a lot of countries already, and it confirms the effectiveness of IPS. IPS is the only evidence-based methodology that works for people with severe psychiatric disorders. But how do we do this? IPS contains 8 principles, and those principles are always in our minds as IPS coaches, as IPS supervisors like me. In every action we do, we focus only on regular competitive jobs. Paid work is our goal. We don't guide our clients into voluntary work or into sheltered workplaces. We really focus on those competitive jobs. And we do that with every job seeker with a mental health problem that has a desire to work. And this is zero exclusion principle. It's very important to us. We don't take diagnosis, severity of symptoms, or hospitalization into account, whether to start up with the program or not. But to do that, we really need this third principle, that we have to have a close cooperation and coordination with the mental health teams of our clients. The better we can work together, the more results we're gonna achieve. What's different sometimes as well with other programs is we don't focus on filling in the vacancies that are like cleaning ladies or retail jobs. We focus on the job preference of our clients, because we see that the closer we get to the dream job of our client, the more motivated he will be, the more powerful he will be, and the better it will be for his recovery as well. Our IPS coaches do not only support our job search, they support on the job, and they support also on the income. We really try to give all the information to our clients before, regarding benefits and consequences of starting to work again, because benefits will maybe come later, will decrease because of the income out of work will raise. If there are problems regarding administration, we will try to solve them with them, so they can focus and really on the job. The IPS stands for placement and support. So the place then train principle is very important for us. Within 30 days, we will have the first encounter with an employer or the labor market. So we don't do general assessments. We don't talk too much. We go straight into the action. And who is better to judge a resume than an employer? Who is better to tell what you have to do to get a certain job than an employer? To do that, we need a network of employers. Every job coach needs to establish that in his region. And for that, we ask them to have at least 6 meetings with employers each week, so they can really maintain their networks and their relationships with employers, and they really need what these employers need, so they can make matches when possible. The IPS support is doesn't have an end date. We continue our support individualized on each client as long as needed by the client. Those 8 principles are written down into 25 criteria, which is very important, because evidence already told us in the past that the closer you get to the model, the more results you're going to achieve. So every IPS program needs to have an international fidelity review to get closer to this model every time. Our first is planned in February for next year, so that's we're very we're looking forward to it. How is IPS Flanders in practice right now? We have 624 clients in IPS. We have these in the study, and it's a randomized group or control group of 440 people, and 440 people having the IPS. These groups were filled in the summer of 21, and VDAB, our employment services, together with the NIHDI, decided to prolong the program to give more opportunities to new clients to get into the program. That's our IPS 2.0 group. We see an employment rate of our target group for 39%. It's a very stable figure. And we see right now a 35% employment rate for the second group. And this rate is still growing. We see it every quarter. We see this number raising, but they only started later on into the program, so that's normal. It should be now 37, but this report isn't published yet, the last one. So yesterday we saw it 37, so it's still raising. We had some preliminary results for the study as well. So our researchers from the University of Brussels, they already examined a lot of things, and they saw that in SE, we call it still SE in the study because we don't have our IPS label yet. We're waiting for February. So we see that people in the IPS group have a high probability to work part-time after 18 months. they have more monthly earnings than the other group. It's raising by 119 euros after 18 months. And we see that there are benefits they need from the disability insurance that they are lower. So that's a good sign as well in the cost effectiveness for IPS. So we're waiting these results anxiously to see what this is going to be. During COVID-19, we didn't see any effects on our target group, and that's a very good thing as well. We see that because a lot of our clients are going to work part-time, we see that they don't really exit the disability insurance, but they have a combination of incomes, benefits from the disability insurance, and they have income from work. And a very important thing, I think, is the last one. We see that with this group, it doesn't affect health or well-being, and that's very important because there is a prejudice that with a vulnerable group of people with mental illnesses, we have to be careful. We have to go slow, and our results show now that we can go faster. We do it careful as well, but you can go fast and you can aim for paid work with this group of people, and it doesn't have any negative impact on their well-being or their health. So if there are some questions afterwards, I would love to elaborate some more. And if people want to connect more, you can always contact me after the webinar as well.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed, Dan. And it's always great to see already some practical, encouraging results from these initiatives. Nice to see that it's making a positive difference, and also really important in the context of our discussion, because I know, for example, in the Q&A, people have been talking about the importance of adapting workplaces to people with physical disabilities, but working with people with mental health issues is obviously also a really big issue and challenge, and we need to find good ways to do that, and your initiative can give people inspiration in that context. So congratulations and thank you for your presentation. Now we have our final contribution. We're delighted that Álvaro Cusero is joining us from the European Disability Forum. Álvaro, we're going to hear your perspective either on what you've heard or just thoughts that you prepared in terms of how you see the disability perspective within public employment services and the key issues from the perspective of the Disability Forum. Please, you have the floor for 10 minutes.
Thank you so much, Ed. Unfortunately, I don't have a PowerPoint, so you have to see my face. But in any case, I will post our website is open, and we're always open to suggestions and questions. I will post our email addresses so anybody can send us any comments. First of all, I would like to present the European Disability Forum, our organization, which is an umbrella organization defending the rights of persons with disabilities in Europe. It means that we have members in all the European member states, in the EU, and also in other European countries, representing people from various disability groups. In total, we're speaking about the representation of about 100 million people around Europe through the 104 organizations that are members. And we advocate for the implementation of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. That is our main task. And well, employment, Article 27, is a huge part of our work because we understand the relevance of employment in the long task of the construction of the social inclusion for everyone, regardless of condition, origin, status. Employment builds social relations. It's the main framework outside the family that, after formal education, around which socialization takes place. So it's a structure we spend most hours every day, and we relate with people from a wider variety of places. So for us, ending segregation in employment has been of the utmost importance. For a long time. This is why we cannot discuss about social inclusion until employment rights and quality employment in the open labor market is a reality. The UNCRPD, the Commission, is very clear about it. So we are aware that employment rates of persons with disabilities remain extremely low. We have already spoke about it in Europe and worldwide. It is not something new, and the institutions have raised the issue many times and included it as one of the main challenges to tackle through the current disabilities strategy. That's why the employment package is here, and that is why we're here. It has been said, we're speaking about 50.8% of persons with disabilities employed compared to 75.6% of persons without disabilities. This was the case before the pandemic, which certainly had a huge impact on employment rates and still affects, even if we don't have a specific data yet. But with the current inflation crisis, the employment problem only worsens the situation of persons with disabilities and the risk of poverty and social exclusion linked to the raise of the cost of living, of course. And for women with disabilities, we have to mention that as well, the case is even worse, where on average, only 48.3% of women with disabilities are in employment, and about full-time employment, 20.6% of women with disabilities, to 28.5% of men with disabilities. They're working full-time. So it's astoundingly low, And I want to highlight something that we don't analyze very often, and I think links to the solutions that we're speaking about today, which are the activity and inactivity rates. Back in 2020, before the pandemic, only 61% of persons with disabilities between 20 and 65 years old, I'm speaking working age, were active, compared to 82.3% of persons with disabilities. That means that not 1 out of 2 persons with disabilities work, but less than 1 out of 3 in the European Union. Those 39% of persons are not even counted as unemployed. They're just left apart for different reasons. They're not socially included at all. Some of the reasons are that they are already inactive because of the age. That means that they have retirement pensions, knowing that persons with disabilities usually retire before persons without disabilities, or others may have disability-related support and social benefits, and they risk losing them if they start working. This is a situation member states should tackle as soon as possible. Disability support is not there as a substitution of salaries, but to cover disability-related costs. One should not lose it after he or she starts working. And other reasons for inactivity are longer standing periods, for example, or being the carriers of other persons. That's very common for women with disabilities, but also that many persons with disabilities do not think they can work. They haven't even thought about it. Many times they have been told so, perhaps overprotection paints again a bad picture. So the first step is to reach these people and offer the possibilities, increase their self-confidence and support them in the process. And this, by the way, since the start of their potential careers, very first point. The example we saw that today is a really good case that has been implemented for many years with really good results. So I want to thank Mrs. Porter for bringing it. And I said it's important to rate this employability as soon as possible, as soon as people leave the educational system, because without it, the possibilities of staying in the labor market are lower. We have recent studies showing that there's a huge difference in the capacity to maintain employment between a person with a disability who joins the labor market soon and another that does it after being inactive for a period of time. Reactivation is more costly and less effective than early inclusion. And here, public employment services play a crucial role. For a long time, there was no or very little focus on disability through the mediation process. There were exceptions, of course. The European Union is huge and very diverse, and the national situations are also different. But this was in general terms. Employers many times do not know where. It's not always that they don't want to. Sometimes they don't know how or where to ask when looking for employees with disabilities, both because they want to hire them or to fulfill quotas. It doesn't matter. But also, persons with disabilities many times they know where to start. Looking for support to enter the labor market, and that's still a problem nowadays. Unfortunately, that's why there was a growth of series of public or private projects, mainly through the social economy and through foundations, by the way, aiming at mediating between both sides. All around Europe, these models support employee or the future employee with guidance, capacitation, and assistance in the workplace. Support employment, for example, like the case of the IPS in Flanders we just learned about. These are very good practices with European funding, by the way, most of the times, that understand the disability perspective. This means, as a major turning point, that the mediation, the link between a person with a disability and a work career is developed taking into account the will of that person and his or her capacities, skills, rather than the outdated system of linking a job sector to a person with a disability according to whatever this disability appears to permit. Now, that's patronizing and does not fulfill the right of the person with a disability to follow the career they want and they are better at. The adaptation must be from the workplace to disability, not the other way around. And now it's crucial that public employment services gather these experiences. Thank you for bringing them, and serve as a common window. Let's say this includes two main tasks: the inclusion of the disability perspective in the procedure, together with training to service providers, and further dissemination of the labor possibilities for persons with disabilities. That's among these persons looking for a job and employers looking for people with disabilities, of course. The first group needs to understand that they can get skills and afterwards work with eventual support if needed, and they can be as capable as anybody, as we have seen. Then the latter, the employers, need to know that there are persons with disabilities talented enough and willing to fill the work opportunities that they have. That most member states have different systems to support the rules and security exceptions. But many employers, we saw that they don't know about it. Because in many cases here, the problem is not about legislation, that too in some particular points, but about knowledge on these available resources and when to ask for them. That together, by the way, with the eradication of the stigma and discrimination, there are still many environments called about working capacities, but that will be covered by another measure within the employment package to be published next year. So to wrap up, these guidelines are extremely useful and very timely as well. From the European Disability Forum, we fully welcome the initiative and we're supporting whichever needs you have in this process of application at national level as well, both us and through our members, because we have members everywhere, remember. And in the end, coordination and communication with persons with disabilities themselves and their representative organization is the only way to fulfill a project oriented at disability inclusion, because as our motto says, nothing about us without us. So thank you for counting on us here, and let's keep in touch both at European and national levels. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much indeed, Alvaro, and thank you for joining us today and bringing this important contribution into our discussions. We're delighted to have you with us. So we've had a really interesting range of presentations, covered a lot of topics. That's going to make for quite a challenging Q&A, I think, because there's so many different angles to be attacked and to discuss. I'm going to hand the floor in a second to Eamon to support us a little bit through that process. Otherwise, Eamon, I thought there was a question right at the beginning, and I thought it was quite important just that we're clear on terminology. There's a question right at the beginning about what sheltered employment means, and I don't know, Eamon, if you could just very quickly give a quick answer to that, so that people are clear what we're talking about when we talk about sheltered employment, and then any other observations you want to make on the conversation we've had so far.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ed. Classically, sheltered employment means it's a subsidised workplace where people with disabilities are involved in certain activities, often taking account of perhaps the fact that they may have certain barriers to being able to kind of operate at a level which people might be outside the sheltered environment. And these organisations are often supported by governments or NGOs or other charities, and they kind of act as a subsidy. But the important point is that they do enable people to be actively involved and making a contribution. There have been some moves perhaps to try and see sheltered employment more as a platform towards employment in the open economy and labour market. And there have been interesting developments recently in terms of things such as job carving, where rather than having people in an environment where the jobs are essentially tailored perhaps to a large extent to take into account the fact that people may have certain limitations on their productivity, there's been a move towards an approach where employers can perhaps adjust open labour market jobs to take account of people's disability, rather than having them in a kind of environment where there's a sort of an assumption, which means that people won't be as productive essentially. So that's probably sheltered employment. And then there's been a move towards this idea of people operating in more of an open labour market environment, and jobs can be adjusted in an ordinary labour market rather than one where all the people involved in the organisation have disabilities.
Okay, thank you for that, Eamon. Yeah, did you want to then take us forward? We have about 15 minutes really for us ahead of us to have a Q&A. Lots of different topics being raised in the Q&A. Eamon, do you want to pick up on anything that caught your attention?
Yeah, particularly, it was very interesting, the contribution, of course, from France, where there is this very, very keen engagement with employers and an opportunity to really raise the profile of employers. In terms of the intervention from our colleague from Flanders, the role of the NGO being particularly important and a particularly well-focused methodology. In terms of the questions that we have from around the webinar, lots of questions about the need to collect adequate data and how data can be sort of used to evaluate the success of these particular programs. Clearly, there's a lot as well about how the engagement of employers can operate in a way of increasing the overall awareness of the issue of disability employment and try and change the mentality of employers to have a positive attitude and accept that people with disabilities can make an equal and indeed sometimes more beneficial contribution, and sort of overcoming some of the initial prejudice which people can suffer in terms of trying to access work. There are issues about the funding of initiatives to support disability employment and how different partners can come together and how funding can be used to ensure that these programs can be sustainable on an ongoing basis. And from the Q&A as well, we've got some questions about whether perhaps there is a need for an intersectional approach. So just not looking at disabilities, subject in itself, but looking at perhaps some of the particular issues faced by people with disabilities from minority groups who sometimes are subject to perhaps more difficulties on the labour market and can be caught in a sort of poverty trap. So what more can be done to also ensure that people with disabilities from certain particular ethnic minority groups can also be given the support that they require. So lots of interesting sort of observations there on the overall issue, looking at how the disability employment package can be implemented, and also comments on how the green agenda can be played into this as well. So how jobs can be accessible to people with disabilities, but also ensuring that the green economy can be supported through this process. So some of the kind of overall observations from the Q&A so far. Taking forward some of the questions that have been posed by our webinar attendees this morning. Perhaps I could ask Sandrine first. In terms of the Due Day initiative, have you had any sort of observations about how perhaps there can be targeting of people who are not just disabled, but also people who are from particular vulnerable groups on the labour market, ethnic minorities, migrants and others? Has that featured in your programme so far?
Well, actually, Due Day is for the moment dedicated to persons with disabilities, but we also have other programs for other vulnerable people. But this Due Day is a particular format as I presented. So it's not it's all kind of disability, even if we don't include some kind of serious mental illness, for example, because it's a very particular kind of disability. But as I said, we have other disposals that we could talk about. But Due Day is it's not been existing for a very long time. So we are not starting, but it's quite new. So it's not yet broadened to other types of publics.
Thank you. And perhaps one follow-up question, Sandrine, if I may. Could you advise us how many colleagues from Pôle Emploi have been involved in Due Days so far? So how many people from the Public Employment Service have been involved in the initiative?
So in the slide that I showed, that we have some figures for 2021, but as I answered in the discussion, we are going to delve into the results, because I saw that participants are curious to know what are the results in terms of employment. So we are going to find and look for other figures and results to share. Maybe if you don't mind, so we can find some other things to enrich the responses. But in the slide that I showed, we had last year more than 9,000 employers involved in the Duo Day, and a little bit more than 30,000 persons with disabilities, which means about 17,000 pairs created last year.
Okay, thank you very much. If I could move on to ask a question for our colleague from the Disability Forum,
Thank you.
Alvaro. Alvaro, what do you think is particularly important in terms of changing the mentality of employers? Could you share a couple of observations with us about how we can really start to kind of overcome prejudice and challenge negative perceptions and create a mindset which is very well disposed towards employing people with disabilities?
Well, we have seen that cases of I said before social economic enterprises because that's the most common, but cases of enterprises competing in the open labor market, hiring persons with disabilities in higher percentages than the quotas, and really competing. Those examples that your competitors are actually carrying out of persons with disabilities, I think, work better than any kind of any other kind of task that you do. Seeing people around your workplace and seeing that they work the same level that other employers, because that's the reality, is what better shows that you should hire more persons with disabilities, knowing that you have them looking for a job. But yeah, also the public employment, not the public employment services, sorry, but national members should try to work better with the alternatives to quotas. We have quotas in many countries. Sometimes they are barely ever reached, and the alternative measures, such as paying fines, sometimes is better accepted by companies than hiring persons with disabilities. Those alternative measures should be harder, because if companies can just jump the quotas with lower expenses in the fine, that what they think will cost them to hire persons with disabilities, is that we do have a big stigma. Put correct fines or alternative measures, make them fulfill the quota, but at the same time, the moment when you see those persons working, I think that shows the best that you can help persons with disabilities. I also wanted to use the opportunity to ask, it was not this case, but maybe for future occasions, that to put some accessibility measures in the conferences, because right now I cannot see, I don't know if it's my problem, but I cannot see any sign language interpretation, for example. So just a suggestion for future occasions so we can be more inclusive. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Dan, we have a question looking at the particular issues of working with people with mental health issues. Would you be able to share with us any views, perhaps, of some of the particular challenges that your specialist staff on the programme face in dealing with clients who've got mental health problems, which are their primary barrier to employment? Thank you.
Yeah. I think that there are two things that our IPS coaches is more difficult for them. I think the importance of working in collaboration with the mental health teams is not to be underestimated, because our IPS coach is working really on getting a job and maintaining the job, and not therapeutical. So that's very important. That's to really don't underestimate that topic. The other one, if we go regarding to employers, there are some prejudices. So I saw questions as well, like if they need to disclose they have problems with mental health issues. So we talk about those prejudices, and we enlighten them to choose to disclose or not to disclose, but it's always the free will of the client. And towards employers, we start in our approach to employers, not about with our clients, we go to talk to employers and ask, how is your situation as an employer? How is your company doing right now? I heard the word job carving before, and it's a very important thing for us, because if you talk to employers and you know what their problems are, and you can try to find a solution or a partial solution for these employers, then we notice and we experience that they are willing to talk about a lot of things. They are willing to talk about hiring somebody for less hours or less tasks if it helps them. And they are willing to not only hire, but to also pay them for the work they deliver. So it's a shift of in the mindset. So we don't go and try to sell our clients, but we go to try to get to know the employers, and then we can match them. So that's our vision on how to do this. But it's a difficult thing to learn and to train for. So we manage.
Thank you very much. Sandrine, could I ask you, we've got some couple of interesting queries about, are the travelling costs of clients covered when they are participating in GeoDay activities? Would you be able to kind of offer us any information on that particular aspect?
Actually, we sorry, we try to make pairs in a close distance in order to make things convenient and easy. And you saw that a duo day is just for one day. Yeah. So we try not to make things difficult. And if we see that there is a long distance for the people with disability, we are going to try to find a more convenient and a closer place, a closer venue for these people, you know, for the person with disability, in order for him to have a better experience and not to have too many difficulties for this this short day.
Thank you very much. Darling, perhaps I could bring you back in. Could you just share a little bit more with us about the extent to which advisors specialise looking at certain sorts of disabilities? So how far do they have more of a sort of generic role, or how far do you seek to have support workers and counsellors who are very, very much focused on particular aspects of disability? So what's the balance there?
No, our IPS coaches, they just work, they have a caseload of 20 clients, so it's a very important thing. And these 20 clients, they all have just one thing in common, and that is, I want to get to a paid job, and I want to work as fast as I can, and I need some kind of support probably when I have a job to maintain my job. And it can be the whole range of mental illnesses. It can be a lot of different things. So it's more general, but that's why we again have to work very closely to their mental health team to look what's very important for this individual client, because it's not because you have a psychosis that everybody with a psychosis is the same person. So it's always individually. So I think, is that an answer to your question?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, perhaps another question in terms of your methodology. Lots of people quite rightly very impressed with what you're doing in terms of the methodology applied, and people are wondering, has your kind of approach been shared with other organisations, and has it been exported perhaps within Flanders, Belgium more widely, or indeed to similar organisations in other countries? So have other people learnt from your experiences and sought to adapt them?
Yeah. Yes, I started with the presentation. It's not our methodology. So it started in the US 40 years ago. England was very quickly to jump on that train as well. And it's all spreading through Europe. So we've got colleagues in Finland, in the Netherlands, in Norway, and I'm probably forgetting Italy as well, but I'm forgetting France as well. And so we've got a lot of countries doing it. And So it's spreading, and because it's evidence-based and you need this fidelity review to call yourself an IPS organization as well, you all speak the same language. Whether in what country you are and you do IPS, you know what you're talking about. So it's spreading the network. So anybody wants to know more or spread the networking cell, just let me know.
Perhaps then if I could ask what may be unfortunately a final question to Alvaro in terms of the importance of early interventions, and perhaps starting with a more integrated approach between education and the transitions into sort of training for work. Is there more that could be done to try and have a more integrated package of support for disabled people, taking into account sort of education, training and a transition to work, do you think? So more of an early interventionist approach.
So yeah, indeed, the general problem about employment starts in the education. I mean, through the several different education systems in Europe, inclusion of persons with disabilities is not yet a reality. We have seen how we have many different approaches. Some are more advanced regarding inclusion, some others are still lagging behind, but we are not there yet. And many persons with disabilities around Europe are finishing a school without certifications. They're finishing school afterwards, and they don't have any certification that allows them to enter the workplace. That's a huge problem. That's why we're also seeing, that's more recent, but we're also seeing further training programs. Also, most of the cases they are private or foundations doing training programs that give this person certifications so they can start looking for a job.
Just before we have some kind of concluding remarks, we're going to just ask my colleagues to launch a poll to get your feedback on today's webinar so that we can continue to improve these to meet the needs of our audience. I also wanted to just raise a couple of things that I saw in the chat that I think deserve to be mentioned. There was, after the question about sheltered employment and the definition given by Eamon, there was a comment in the chat about observing that research is showing that sheltered employment can be often a segregating practice and not serving to really integrate, but to maintain segregation. So it's important I just wanted to recognize that comment that I saw in the chat. It's important to take that into account. And also I thought it was really important, the observation that jobs are changing in the context of digitalization and greening. Jobs are changing, and we need to better understand how these evolving jobs open up maybe new opportunities for people with different forms of disability, and understanding how those match up is going to be an important challenge for the future. But that said, whilst you're finishing the poll, I'm going to give the final word really to Elodie, because obviously we've covered a lot of really interesting topics today. We can't solve all the challenges we have in a 1.5-hour webinar, but this topic is going to remain on the agenda of the European Network of Public Employment Services. And maybe Elodie, you can just give us your final words of what you take away from today's webinar and any messages for our audience.
Thank you very much, Ed. Well, first, I would really like to thank all our panelists and participants for the very active exchange, and really for us, the work doesn't stop here. And I think there's really a lot of food for thought, not only on how to organize events such as today, but really on the points that need further exploring, like, for example, the relationship to employers, the whole question of sheltered employment, and also outreach and partnerships, basically with the whole range of PES partners. I guess I will really focus on the question of how we take it from there, also as a PES network. Well, clearly, this webinar is really the tip of the iceberg. There's really a lot of activities in the PES network. Every year we have about 20 activities, close to 2,000 participants in events, and support to vulnerable customers, to customers in vulnerable situations is really at the heart of the network. So I would really invite you to register to the newsletter, to try to go and visit the Knowledge Center, because there's also a lot of materials that touch upon the question of support to persons with disabilities. For example, last year, we also had a report earlier this year on the PES actions to tackle discrimination, where you can find also a lot more data and practices. Very soon, we will actually release a podcast on diversity with the Brussels PES activists, focusing on diversity on I would say in the broad sense. And clearly, so there will be a lot of things related to this. But when it comes to really the topic of the conference today, so what are the next steps? I guess my main message would be really, now the toolkit has been released and implementation is in your hands. In a sense, you as PES, as partners of the PES, obviously public employment services are in very different steps on their journey to support persons with disabilities. But we believe the toolkit is a good tool to get the conversation started and to actually really see what's the state of play in your PES, what new steps can be taken. And we really hope there's something in there for everyone, so to say. So really implementation is in your hands, so to say, but it doesn't mean that we are stopping here as a network. We are currently discussing the work program for the years ahead, and it's quite clear that there's an interest in continuing the conversation on the topic of today, on how we can do better to support persons with disabilities. So clearly, we will come back to the topic, and there's really a lot, I think, that we've learned today, and things that we can try to explore further in the follow-up work. So we really hope also to build on today's webinar and to be in touch for the next steps. So I think I will stop here, but I would also like to thank obviously also you, Ed, and Eamon as moderator and experts. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elodie. That's a nice roundup, and I think just also to reinforce, thanks to all the people that have joined us. It also shows the interest in this topic, how important it is. That it's great to see so many people and people thanking us. It's very kind to see these comments in the chat. So hopefully we continue to move the conversation forward. Elodie's shown how the network will keep working on these topics, and so I wish everyone, wherever you are in Europe, all the best in continuing your efforts on these topics, and the network will do its best to support where it can and continue to move the conversation forward. So with that, have a very good rest of the day. It's still the morning. I was about to say good afternoon, but it's still the morning. So there's still plenty of day ahead of us. Have a good rest of your day, and we hope to see many of you again in future events of the European Network of Public Employment Services. Thank you and goodbye.